how do people make decisions about what they're going to consume and how does it resonate with them? And if AI can achieve it, then from an economic perspective, it will work.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing great conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: when you use ChatGPT, you could be liable for what it produces. Dr. Lance Elliott, who I cite frequently and will hopefully have as a guest on the show soon, writes in Forbes this week that you are liable for any damage caused by work you claim is your own that was actually generated by an open AI product. If, for example, ChatGPT used someone else's copyrighted work to generate the new item you requested, you may be inadvertently violating copyright law by reusing it. Dr. Elliott goes into great detail about what's buried in OpenAI's terms of service. Suffice it to say, nobody on the planet other than him is adequately considering the legal ramifications of generative AI within and beyond OpenAI. LLMs like ChatGPT may save us work, but they don't protect us from decades-old fair use laws, or more important, millennia-old codes of ethics. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. And now shifting to this week's great conversation. The Writers Guild of America, the Union of Hollywood Writers, voted to authorize a strike if demands aren't met for higher pay. This is all playing out in real time. A strike would cause potentially a full production shutdown, affecting actors, stagehands, studio crew, and the biggest companies in Hollywood, as scripted series across both network television and streaming could potentially grind to a halt. The WGA has been negotiating with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, which bargains on behalf of the studios. The strike threat is perhaps the highest profile example of shifting dynamics in the entertainment industry. Studios are spending less to produce more content. Fees paid to writers have plummeted. Generative AI is only accelerating the trend. This has profound implications for really the future of storytelling. Today's guest is an expert in the field, having founded Divisadero Pictures all the way back in 2011 to advise entertainment companies from Disney to Comcast to Microsoft on strategy and finance topics. Daniel Davila received his MFA from USC and his MBA from Stanford. Thanks to friend of the podcast, Matthew Perez, for the introduction to Daniel. For some historical perspective, today is only the second episode in more than 190 when we've discussed AI and the future of work in the entertainment industry. For longtime listeners of this podcast, you may recall the last time was episode 87, back in April of 2021, with Michael Solomon and Rishon Blumberg, authors of Game Changer, How to Be 10X in the Talent Economy, who interestingly also managed Bruce Springsteen and John Mayer in a previous life. I'll go ahead and link to that show in the show notes. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Daniel to the podcast. Daniel, let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's good to be here. Really enjoyed the thought that you're putting into these questions. In terms of my background, I've always sort of existed between the two poles of the creative and the financial, or I think more accurately, the economics. So what are the fundamental economics of creative work, of the creative industry? And I bounced between those with an undergraduate degree in film studies, so the very sort of French New Wave style, understanding how film works, but also an undergraduate degree in economics, then the MFA in producing, and an MBA from Stanford. And I've looked throughout the years, both in the creative field and in the more strategic corporate environments, to understand why it is that people choose to consume media, how they consume it, and what the unit economics are of bringing filmed entertainment specifically to the world, but not just filmed entertainment. And so over the course of my career, what I've seen is, the proliferation of different models for delivering content, different models for telling stories. For example, virtual reality, I did early work in that, trying to understand, again, the central question: what are the unit economics? And central to understanding the unit economics is why people decide to allocate their money towards what potential creative product, what filmed entertainment, what music, what do they do with their free time? And so that's the lens that I look at everything in, is sort of, you have this basket of, you have this limited amount of time, consumers do, for what they are interested in consuming. How do they get access to it? Why do they make the choices they make? And how does that trickle out into, models that are workable in the long term? So again, that's on the financial side. At the same time, I've worked in depth in the creative side as a producer, as a writer, and actually as a director, with the same sort of concerns. Is why does creative property resonate, and in what way with what people? It's the same sort of question. And if I were to synthesize all of that, I would really go towards the economy of human experience. And that's what entertainment really, that's where it lives. It lives in the decision making around why we do what we do and how we spend our time. That is how those two things connect, and that's sort of what has driven all of my thinking and work for the last 2 decades.
Let's start at a high level. All of those are interesting topics, but what would you say is the threat or the opportunity posed by AI for the entertainment industry?
Well, and you and I were touching briefly on this at the beginning of the conversation, which is that I think there are philosophical questions, and then there are, very simple economics. So let's tease those apart and try and keep them high level for the moment. The philosophical is, can generative AI create something that resonates with people? And that's where you can go down a bunch of avenues, saying, what does that mean to resonate? What is the experience of it? What is the nature of generative AI? How's the model built? What's it pulling from? How's new work created, et cetera? So all of those questions, and we could get into those. The economic side is less abstract in the following way, in that generative AI can be an input to creative properties. It can be the basis for, or maybe at some point, the entirety of some sort of creative output. So those are the two possibilities: the philosophical, does it satisfy emotionally? And then the economic, is it a valuable input? And they dovetail right in the middle, again, with that: how do people make decisions about what they're going to consume, and how does it resonate with them? And if AI can achieve it, then from an economic perspective, it will work. But I think there's a lot of questions at the moment about whether that's true. Then you have the externalities and the questions about the ethics of it and all the rest, which, again, each one of those topics is an hour. It's 2 hours, it's 3 hours, it's a whole lifetime of questions. So those are the two buckets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let's start with the life cycle of a piece of content, a movie, let's say, something you've lived many times over. Where do you see the biggest potential for AI to contribute to the creative process? Everything from start with the writing of a script through to producing, filming it, producing it, perhaps even financing it, and then maybe even marketing it. Just start broad. Where do you think there are opportunities?
So again, I'll start with conceptually how I think about this question, which is, and where I think the real immediate opportunity is. Actually, let me step back a second and say that today, the generative AI is a marginal play for entertainment today. That's not going to be true going forward. It's the growth. We know this from a technological perspective, from a scientific perspective. It's just the models are going to get stronger. What they're able to create is going to get stronger. So if you're asking the question of like, how does this work within the life cycle? Well, today it'll be a marginal play, but I think a valuable one. In the future, it may become more substantial. So let's look at the different pieces that you proposed, which is, the creative origination, then to the marketing and potentially the financing and how that would work from an AI perspective. But we'll start with the one that seems to be maybe the sexiest, which is the creative, the actual generative part of it. What can AI do today that wasn't possible a couple of years ago? Well, listeners to this podcast, I'm sure, are tracking the developments in generative AI and are familiar with basically what the capabilities are. So let's look at it from a story perspective or a script perspective. You can go into an AI at the moment, a chat GPT, and make requests of it to generate a bunch of story ideas. Are those story ideas good? Well, that's the part that AI really can't evaluate yet. And that's one of the sort of the truisms of entertainment generally. The one of the axioms that I'm sure, Dan, I know that you've worked in the entertainment space, so you know this to be true, is that nobody knows anything. Whether AI is going to change that, we don't know yet. But essentially, what works creatively really comes down to something that at the moment is ineffable. Right. And this is where, again, I kind of spiral into the philosophical, because there is this question of, well, can AI, eventually, as it develops further complexity, tap into that ineffability, really get to what it means for a piece of content to be creatively satisfying. I personally, and this there are going to be people who have different perspectives, I think it will, because I think it is a function of the, basically it's an information paradigm. And this is a specific application of an information paradigm. And there's nothing particularly exotic about it. How far that is in the future? Well, I think the question is similar to what you might think of when it comes to autonomous vehicles, right? Which is, if you'd ask someone a couple of years ago, you'd say they're going to take over everything. And they haven't. I mean, there's risk profile issues there, but you could see the same in generative AI. What are the risks of it? So on the content generation, to bring it back to your question on the specifics of content generation, at the moment, it's a marginal play that can help you ideate. And that ideation, I think, fits with a lot of applications for AI, which it's taking some of the grunt work out of the process. I don't think that massively displaces creatives at the moment. But again, the future will look different. So I think that doing some of that grunt work, coming up with sort of grist for the mill or clay for the molding, that's really valuable. To the marketing side, I think that we've already seen versions of, models or that verge on AI, complex models, the Netflixes of the world, the streamers, who are using that kind of data as sort of a learning algorithm paradigm that understands what it is that people like. There is a gap, though, between understanding that at a marketing level and actually executing on a piece of talent. And that is one of the central challenges. And I would say the overriding challenge of the entertainment industry is that execution is so much a part of it. And it is very difficult to prototype a film, for example, if we're looking at just feature films, which is the area I know best. It is very difficult to have a script and turn that into something that behaves anywhere near like the production at scale. So if you have a widget, you can manufacture 10 of them, test them before you do a massive run. If you're doing a $200 million movie, you can't do that. So that's a long-term opportunity for AI, is to actually be able to prototype. And that feeds into the marketing question, because you'd be able to say, go to market and say, like, does this work? You could test it at an individual level or go beyond that. And then you have a synthesis of sort of the generative piece of saying, like, okay, we made a prototype of this, and we're going to use the learning models that give us an understanding of what the audience wants. And suddenly you're reducing risk. And I think that's nearer term than the full generation. And I'll give you an example. I produce films, and we have a brand new project that over the last 2 months, we did a super deep dive into the graphical generative AIs. And we worked with Dolly, we worked with Firefly, we worked with Midjourney, and Midjourney happened to be the most useful, but using all three in tandem was really effective. At the end of the day, we just finished this. We have a 70-page document that looks like 200 stills taken from a movie that's never been made, which is potentially transformative. The question that we have is, well, what does this mean to the marketplace? And we don't know that yet. Because if you look at it, there's creative decisions. It's a compelling document, but how does that change the way that people think about movies? We're not sure yet, and that's kind of I think that speaks to where AI is in the sort of the value proposition of how movies get made, and in the process questions about how do you use these technologies to move it forward, which. This dovetails. We've gone from the creative generation, how can you use AI tools now and in the future to generate content? We've touched on the marketing, the way that, the generative components can kind of synthesize with, marketing back-end data to kind of de-risk the creation of content. And now we're looking at the financing, which is a combination of all those three things, because as you finance entertainment content, you are really trying to understand what is it going to look like, how can you de-risk it, and then understanding what is the financial possibilities of that content based on sort of the synthesis of all of those things. And so I think long-term AI will have a part to play in all of those. As I said from the outset, at the moment, it's marginal, but if I can sit here and synthesize it in the way that I just did, I don't think that there's any reason that a sophisticated enough model couldn't do exactly the same thing. It's a structured approach to thinking about information, and entertainment at the end of the day, for all that we say about how it affects our hearts and minds, is an information stream.
It feels like we're on the cusp of call it a Moneyball moment in the entertainment industry, referring to Billy Beane and the Oakland A's, and then the Michael Lewis retelling of the story, where we learned that something that purists would say, it's about hearts and passions, and baseball is a game of intuition. And Billy Beane came and said, maybe we can solve baseball problems with data. What if we can, quote, solve or automate the creative process with AI? You referred to Midjourney producing 270 photorealistic images for presumably a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time. Give your pitch to a purist. Let's say you're pitching that concept to Francis Ford Coppola. What are you saying is a reason why he or she, if it's a female producer, should be ready to adopt this new way of thinking?
Well, I think there's two, again, I would tease out the two dimensions in the question that you just asked. There's the creative side, which goes to the Midjourney part of the question. And then there is the Moneyball perspective. So I guess maybe then the question that you're asking is, how do those, like the synthesis version of that's what you think is worth pitching. Okay, I gotcha. So what I would say to Francis Ford Coppola or whomever is that for your entire life, you've had dreams, and you've turned those dreams into words on a page. And then you have used your passion and your vision to go around and convince people that you can take it from this thing, this inchoate thing, this lifeless thing on the page, into something that breathes fire, that people are going to respond to emotionally and really love. With these new tools, you can not only see your dreams concretely in front of you for, as you said, Dan, for a fraction of the cost, and fraction of the personnel, which is the driver of that cost, but you can also add data to it so that you can express your vision in creative terms with a force that wasn't previously possible, as well as in financial terms that's going to resonate for the people that need to see those numbers. And that combination is going to make you more powerful than ever. You're still the driving force. You're still the visionary. It's still your dream, but it can get from your head to something tangible and addressable much faster, and with the financial data to back it up. That's my pitch.
I'm not sold yet, but let me continue to ask more questions. Maybe you'll convince me by the end of the discussion. So
interesting.
You got your MFA from arguably, probably the top program in the world from USC. And the thing that fuels this industry, the stories that I, as a theater goer, love to hear are the ones that are told by great storytellers who are passionate about their craft and invest in the telling of great stories because they believe there's a market and the world needs to be entertained. Well, that all sounds great until potentially you referred to the unit economics of the entertainment industry break down. So does a younger version of Daniel choose to still invest that time and the massive amount of money in getting an MFA degree from USC if you think that your earning potential is a fraction of what it was? Maybe you're forced to pursue a different degree just because you want to make sure you can monetize that degree. Like, does this shake the foundations of the entertainment industry to its core, starting with the talent that we need to be able to invest in these creative pursuits?
Well, I think there are, again, a couple things going on there and in your question. It's a compound question. What would I do differently? What are the factors that are driving people's ability to monetize what they've learned? Is it the right thing to study? And why are those trends happening? And let me start by, I think part of the reason that writing talent is paid less, and part of the reason for the writer's strike at the moment, my read on it anyway, is the change driven by streaming. And it's just basically that you're tying up more writers for less time. That's simply. So if you were to look at the compensation writ large, the net compensation of all the writers is higher because there's more spend on entertainment. But you're doing 10 episodes and you're doing it for a streamer, which has lower viewership and on the old contract. And you do those 10 episodes, that means there's the opportunity cost of doing anything else, right? And getting onto another show. So those fundamental economics for writers, I think, are really what's driving the current debate. I don't think that AI in its current state will play a massive factor in that debate. If you had asked me 2 months ago if I thought it was going to have a massive impact, I think I probably would have felt differently. But the last 2 months of interacting daily for hours and hours and hours with these models has made clear like how powerful they are and how far they have yet to go. And more importantly, the role that non-cybernetic individuals, non-AI intelligences, actual intelligence still has to play in sort of either the curation, the tailoring, the redirecting of the output of these models. And that's both on the query side, the prompt side, as well as the sort of post-generation reprocessing. That's still a very human intensive piece of it. So I mean, I think, again, I'm addressing the dynamics in your question. The practical part of it, would I change what I had studied, or would I advise anyone else to change what they've studied? I would say no, because it's still a craft, and artificial intelligence is a tool within that craft at the moment. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it may look different. That horizon is not clear to me. I'm not sure that I don't think it's a year out. I'm confident it's not 5 years out, and 10 years seems, but again, the explosion over the last couple of years, or I should say months, has really shaken people, I think, and you've used that term, shaken people, giving them a sense of like, wow, what is this thing? And I think that's right, because it is so astonishing, but the delta between what it's doing and what it needs to do is still significant. So I don't think I would change it yet, because I think there's deep learning about craft, deep learning about the history of thought that the AI doesn't capture yet.
We've been focused on, call it the downside, or the under, on the impact of AI in the entertainment industry. Maybe let's take the over now. And question for you. So when I just anecdotally, when I look back at my years at Disney in the 90s, the distribution model for entertainment for films seems just quaint, a little antiquated and just quaint. There were a relatively small number of big screens that a relatively small number of production companies had access to, and they'd pay massive amounts of money to market these movies and, have to pick the window. And well, now, I mean, I think you'd agree that the market for content, for great stories, has exploded with streaming services. You mentioned Netflix, and just the global reach. It's no longer limited to a small number of big screens. So back to the pitch to Francis Ford Coppola, it seems like there's a need to produce a lot more content at scale in order to be able to feed this insatiable global desire for content. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you agree with that?
I do think that there's a demand for content. I think that we are pushing up against the limits of that demand and the limits of available time that you can stare at a screen. It's a very basic human limit. I don't know where that limit is. I think that the trend that you're pointing to is very real, but I'd say that we're in a flattening of the curve at the moment. That's my instinct. And you see that reflected in the sort of necessary streaming cutbacks in costs, the necessary consolidation of platforms, sort of the conventional wisdom that, there's a specific scale that you need in order to actually be a player in the streaming space, which again goes back to the unit economics. But if I were to tease out sort of the siren song that I hear in your question, you tell me if I'm getting this right, which is that there has always been an appeal to kind of the democratization of content creation and the need for better content. And the question that I hear in that is can AI make the difference in sort of filling an unmet need? I think it goes back to everything that we've talked about so far. I think that there will always be a need for good content, but we're reaching a saturation point. You still need, if you have, in the competitive space that entertainment is, if you could make a better piece of content, great. I'm not clear that AI can do that yet. And that's the kind of the performance part of it that goes all the way back to the philosophical question of what makes good content good. And at the moment, this is what makes entertainment so strange. It is a mature business. It's 120, 130 years old, but it's still highly entrepreneurial. And Dan, one of the questions that you put to me in your email before the show was about disintermediation. And the argument I would make is that from distribution perspective, that's very difficult. It's very difficult because the platforms, the access, all of that is really centralized and requires a certain amount of scale. But on the content creation side, I think disintermediation happens all the time because people just come out of nowhere. And the more that these tools, get into the hands of people who aren't in the system, the more likely it is that they're going to create something new that sparks. And then you do have more democratized platforms like YouTube where these things can thrive. But I think in your questioning, I think you've prompted me to have maybe a clearer thesis for this entire thing, which is that these powerful tools at the moment are going to be of greatest benefit to creators who are looking to increase their throughput, to have more variation and really put more content, just take more swings at the plate, more at bats, basically, is what's going to be possible for the average aspiring filmmaker.
On every episode, I like to ask this question because I think as technologists, as leaders, we get too comfortable only thinking about what could go right if we use, let's say, more AI. But I think it's more important to ask what could go wrong. And with respect to how these AI models are trained, I think it's really important for us as part of this conversation to ask, given that LLMs, large language models, are perfectly designed to replicate human bias, and perhaps equally important, and we talk about them hallucinating, but I'm more concerned about this kind of homogenization of content, because when everybody's asking the same questions of them and they're trained on the same content, I hate to think that the integrity of storytelling would be compromised because more creatives are relying on AI. What's your thought on that kind of what could go wrong question?
I think there's a lot of wisdom in asking the question. I think it's a great question. And I think that is a fault of the models, to be sure. I think the current state, though, there's still the human intermediary between the output and the content that gets out there, and there's still that judgment piece. And so in the same way, if random screenwriter writes a screenplay that's filled with bias, there's still a gatekeeper that's evaluating it and saying, oh, that's filled with bias, I don't want to do that. Well, you could say the same thing for generative AI. You look at it and say, this is filled with bias. So as long as there is that intermediary, I think that bias can be contained. I think where this is a bigger issue is in higher throughput endeavors. I think it's, in journalism, in blogging, in the internet more generally, is because really, we've seen this already. We've seen social media and what happens in the social media context. This is a similar computational dynamic, that you have a model that's going to bias in one direction or the other. But on these larger scale, still high touch products, I would say that that's not a risk as yet. But I will note something, just an oddball thing from working with Midjourney. To your point, and I don't know if you've experienced this. Have you worked with Midjourney much?
Dolly too, but not Midjourney.
By the way, check out Midjourney. It's mind blowing, the difference. But in making these stills for this as yet produced feature film, we would try to get a man and a woman, two characters, to interact in a specific way. And there was an actual visual bias in that it would not let, for example, if I tried to get the woman to hold the man as he's dying, that's not an actual scene, but for example, it would not do that. No matter how we prompted it, no matter what elements were in it, it was always the man holding the woman, no matter what you did. Same with objects. If you wanted a woman to be holding an object, the man also had the object. You could never let the woman have the object alone, which is such a strange visual bias baked into the model. But I think it's a great example of what you're pointing to, which is these subtle things that, that would just have to get included in the work if you're going to use the output. The bias would be there.
My first reaction is that it's unbelievable. My second reaction is it's completely believable. Because what else would you expect, right? Think about where it got its training data. Yeah. How could it know any otherwise? It's not sentient. It's not making a judgment about whether the man or the woman should be dying or who holds who. It's just replicating the bias that was encoded in the training data.
Well said. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Daniel, this one's just getting started. I got to get you off the hot seat because we're about out of time, but not without answering one last question for me. So polish your crystal ball. Yeah. So let's say in a decade, we're having another version of this conversation. What has changed about the entertainment industry? Ideally, if you could share both from the perspective of the producers as well as from the perspective of the consumers.
Yeah, on the producer side, I think that the type of document that we just generated will be a kind of a baseline. It'll be expected. I should say that at the moment it was really time intensive because you had to try and get the model to work through all its biases. So I think that plus the previs, additional pre-visualization processes are just going to get stronger and stronger. And you look at, I forget who it is, but one of the founders of Avid, a nonlinear editing system, is on the board of Midjourney. So you know that they're already thinking about that, and that's going to happen. I think that'll increasingly, and I think it'll feed in, as you said, that you were pointing towards, into a marketing model that uses either pre-visualization or back-end data, or a combination of the two. So that's what will change, I think, on the producer side. I think on the consumer side, it's going to be it's going to be harder to navigate the interactions with content and content creators. And you see this already happening in music. And there's going to be a real question as a consumer: what am I interacting with? Am I interacting with something that was created by somebody, or am I interacting with something that was created through some generative AI? I don't think it'll be at the scale of a feature film yet. I think the other thing to be wary about, again, this is unfortunately, I think it's as a consumer, these models tend historically towards greater psychological capture and manipulation. That's just what we've seen over the last 20 years. And so if these technologies remain unregulated, my concern is that AI will be just another tool to really shape broad collective thought, which is not a good thing, and something that we'll have to be watching out for, as well as deep fakes and all the rest. So hopefully 10 years from now, you and I are sitting here saying, like, wow, US government, they really figured it out. We're doing so well. These tools have really freed us up to do more meaningful work.
I hope that's the version of the conversation we're having in a decade, and hopefully you'll come back long before a decade, and we'll have the next version of this conversation.
Amen. I'd like that.
Hey, Daniel, this has been a pleasure. Where can our audience learn more about you and follow your work?
Yeah, check me out at divisaderopictures.com. Have information on a lot of the projects that we've done there, including films and consulting, and feel free to reach out through their info at divisaderopictures.com.
Well, thanks for hanging out. I've really enjoyed this one, and look forward to meeting in person sometime soon.
Yes. Thanks, Dan.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.